want to take the opportunity to thank the organizers of the conference, Claudio and Enrique and the staff as well, for putting this terrific conference together. Thanks too for a provocative paper and for all the work he's done excuse me, in making contextualism a going view in epistemology over the years. I might mention also the curiosity. It's a pleasure for me to be up here with Matthias Stoip, who 20 years ago in the spring of 1984 was my TA in the freshman year epistemology course with Professor Ackerman, Philosophy 3, Skepticism and Knowledge. I think I may be a kind of contextualist about contextualism. Cohen claims contextualism can successfully and anti-skeptically resolve the paradoxes he discusses. Crucially, according to Cohen himself, a successful anti-skeptical resolution of the paradox must explain how, despite our skeptical intuitions, it remains true that we know what we ordinarily claim to know. To summarize my reaction, a problem is that contextualism says nothing about how we know. It's a thesis about the semantics of the verb to know. Now, if we consider contextualism in a different context, in the context of epistemology, it seems less satisfying. So I doubt contextualism provides a resolution of the paradox that respects Cohen's own demand. In these comments, I'll try first to show why contextualism may dissatisfy, and second, to gesture, only briefly at the end, in the direction of an alternative resolution. But I'll begin with two preliminaries. First, let's note that it's not just with skeptical paradox and the lottery analogs that we find ourselves torn in the familiar way. Take any contingency you think you know. Couldn't it be false? Couldn't it be false that you have hands? Ambivalence is pervasive. On one hand, you might think, no way could that be false. I'm looking right at them. On the other hand, of course, you're aware of your fallibility. You claim to know you have hands, but you must admit that, in some sense, perhaps you don't have hands. So can you really be said to know? Contemplation of the possible falsehood of the content of any claimed knowledge tends to have an undermining effect on the thought that we know. I find such cases simpler examples of the sort of phenomenon to which contextualism is responding. In effect, I think any contingency we think we know is itself a potential lottery proposition. That was one preliminary. Second preliminary, we shouldn't ignore, first, the familiar malapropisms to which contextualism is committed. For example, Jones said, truly, quote, I know that P, but he doesn't know that P. Of course, if only to know were like here, there's nothing peculiar about Jones saying truly, I am here, even when he's not here. Consider also the possible literal truth given a mid-sentence shift of, quote, Jones knows that P and he does not know that P. Again, we have no problem with Jones said he'd be arriving right now, and in fact, he said he'd be arriving long before now. But our differential discomfort with these discourses can found an argument against contextualism about to know. And also we should not ignore the issue whether, as contextualists must claim, skeptics are really talking past the ordinary man who claims to know he has hands. When I'm thinking about the demon, do I not know that here is one hand? I find that hard to believe. But these are styles of argument I will not press here. Leaving preliminaries behind, Cohen claims that contextualism can resolve the paradox by construing our apparently inconsistent intuitions as resulting from contextual shifts in the standards for how strong one's epistemic position has to be in order for one to know. This may be harder to interpret than it appears. Is the view really about shifts in the standards for how strong one's epistemic position has to be in order to know, or rather, in order for someone correctly to use the word to know? Our intuition, Cohen says, is that, and I quote, the sentence, Smith knows his car is parked in lot 2, is true is explained by the fact that at ordinary contexts the statement is true. So our intuition is explained by its truth, by the truth in the relevant context of its content, where the content is, as Cohen sees it, about the truth of a sentence. But of course, we also had the intuition, when Cohen was sketching the puzzling scenarios, that Smith knows his car is parked in lot 2. That's an intuition whose content is not, or at least not obviously, about the truth of a sentence. It's about Smith. It too is an intuition that needs to be explained or explained away. Can Cohen explain that intuition in the same way, by noting its truth? Suppose so. Suppose our intuition that Smith knows his car is parked in lot 2 is true. How now to explain the apparently conflicting intuition? For Cohen, again, the conflicting intuition is about the truth value of a sentence. And the explanation is, again, that the relevant sentence has the truth value we intuitively accord it. Accordingly, our apparently conflicting intuitions conflict only apparently. In fact, in Cohen's view, both intuitions, each about the truth value of a sentence, are correct. Each sentence is true relative to the context in which it's used. But because the sentences as used make different claims, if you go that way, there's no conflict. But we also have the intuition that Smith does not know his car has not been stolen. And if we again explain that intuition in terms of its truth, then Smith does not know his car has not been stolen. And if finally we explain our intuition, assuming we have it, that the relevant closure principle is true in terms of the truth of that intuition, then it seems we have not made any progress on our initial puzzle. We would have resolved the lottery paradox by restating its constitutive theses. So I don't see how contextualism addresses that puzzle. We would have asserted an explanation of the puzzle that Smith knows his car is parked in lot 2, that Smith does not know that his car has not been stolen, and that closure is true. That's puzzling. As the paradox is being sketched, our suppositions are, let's say, first, closure. Second, Smith knows that P. Third, Smith knows that if P, then Q. And last, Smith doesn't know that Q. Which of these suppositions was erroneous? And why are we systematically inclined to make such an erroneous supposition? Or systematically inclined to make one or another erroneous supposition in these cases? I interpret contextualism as making the following claim. In any context with respect to which we state these suppositions, only either the second or the last, only either the claim that Smith knows that P or the claim that Smith doesn't know that Q is true, but not both. But to know that assuming the first and the third suppositions, not both the second and the fourth, can be true, doesn't require contextualism. We should all agree that those four suppositions are inconsistent. If contextualism resolves the paradox, that can be only because it explains how we mistakenly think they're both true, when in fact at most one of them is. What's offered is an explanation of how we can think the corresponding pair of sentences is true, when at most one of the pair is true. For that explanation to work, the contextualist needs further, and delivers further, a claim to the effect that we mistake the question whether Smith knows that P for the question whether the sentence Smith knows that P is true. And if the puzzle reappears, even after we keep that distinction clearly in mind, then the contextualist may be forced to claim that our conflating those questions is pathological, that we cannot, in spite of ourselves, distinguish them. But that seems hardly plausible. In the same vein, but it seems to me more problematic, since the paradox is equally troubling when it is not expressed at all, but merely thought, the contextualist has to claim that the relevant context sensitivity affects thought as well. The contextualist's claim is now that one's thought that Smith knows that P is compatible with one's thought that Smith does not know that P. But those thoughts are no more compatible than Smith's knowing and not knowing that P. Compare, or perhaps I should say contrast, the gradable adjective flat. Does it ever seem to be possible, paradoxically, that an item can be flat and yet fail to be flat? No. I think there's no unease in the thought that we can say truly of an object O In one context, quote, O is flat, and in another, quote, O is not flat. But we're not so much as tempted by the thought that there's one and the same property that the thing both has and lacks. With the paradoxes Cohen is discussing, however, something like that is exactly what we are tempted by. Given an acceptable closure principle, we're tempted by inconsistent thoughts. And we're tempted by them even now. We hear the skeptic's sweet siren song still, even after fully contemplating the contextualist alternative. This suggests that contextualism has not adequately explained the paradox. It would be a bad parody of the contextualist position to claim that it analyzes knowledge as requiring, say, truth, belief, warrant, but in addition, that anyone ascribing it to the subject be in a low standards context. Whether Smith knows that P does not come or go as an ascriber changes context. But without some such substantial revision on the conditions on knowledge, it's hard to see how contextualism revises the original paradoxical claims about what we know. I promised to gesture, if only briefly, in the direction of an alternative resolution of the paradoxes. Now, Cohen holds it to lie at the heart of the contextualist account of the paradox that a speaker can be competent in his use of the term and yet be blind to the fact that the term is context sensitive. He calls this a semantic blindness thesis. I've urged that contextualism, even together with such a thesis, cannot adequately resolve the paradoxes. But if a kind of blindness is at the heart of the puzzle, we need not and should not take the detour through semantic knowledge. We should contemplate a philosophical blindness thesis. I don't think it's less plausible than any semantic blindness principle, and it may promise more explanatory force. I, for one, am strongly tempted by the thought that Smith can know that he will not win the lottery, that Smith can know that his car has not been stolen. For starters, I don't accept that knowledge is the norm of assertion or that knowledge is the norm of practical reasoning. And my not thinking that knowledge is the norm of assertion, you'll want to take that into account as you listen to me assert things here. Set that aside. Suppose that instead of postulating that speakers can be competent, but blind to the context sensitivity of their own terms, we postulate that thinkers can be competent, but blind to some facts about knowledge. So a competent thinker may be unable to decide between our earlier number 2 and number 4, the earlier attribution of knowledge to Smith and the denial of Smith having a bit of knowledge that's entailed. A competent thinker may be unable to decide between retracting her settled thought that Smith knows his car is parked in lot 2 and taking on, in spite of herself, the thought that Smith knows that his car has not been stolen. Still, this approach urges at least one of the two is philosophically demanded of us. So we're blind to what is philosophically demanded of us. We cannot see what we must think. Perhaps it will not be too obscure for this crowd to say that this amounts to a kind of epistemicism about knowledge. Epistemicists about vagueness may state their position as the claim that there are sharp hidden boundaries for vague terms, but they embrace substantive metaphysical consequences. The subtraction of a single grain of sand can turn a heap into a non-heap. This is a claim about what it takes to be a heap, and how easily something might cease to be one. I think metaphysical theses do not follow from metalinguistic claims. Rather, those theses are derived independently, however plausibly or implausibly, and the metalinguistic theses are added as reasonable further claims, given the original metaphysical thesis. Really, what epistemicism about vagueness holds is that there are hidden truths about the sharp boundaries of things, like heaps and bald things and green things. Epistemicism about knowledge holds that there are hidden truths about knowledge. We can get ourselves into a fix, not wanting to give up the closure principle, and yet insisting on knowledge ascriptions and denials that are then incompatible. The thesis of philosophical blindness says that we're blind to the truths that are at odds with those ascriptions and denials by which we're tempted. And that's part of why we're so tempted. For example, perhaps we think we know that here is one hand, when in fact we do not know that. Or more likely, we think we do not know that there is no evil demon, but we do. We rather lack something closely related to knowledge that we haven't yet clearly distinguished from it. As with epistemicism about vagueness, the position contemplated here needn't yet accept any particular corrective efforts, just as epistemicists can consistently scoff at any attempt to precify heat. An epistemicist about knowledge can be unwilling to accept the claim that we do know that there is no evil demon, and also not accept the claim that we do not know that here is one hand. On the other hand, we need not accept the analog of the traditional epistemicist claim that we could not reasonably accept a particular precipitation. Let me emphasize before closing that I don't accept epistemicism about vagueness, and I don't affirm the corresponding view about knowledge, much less do I think knowledge is vague. But I do think conceiving of knowledge in the way that epistemicists conceive of vagueness, as in the respective paradoxes revealing a kind of blindness, blind spot, is an alternative worthy of further development and consideration. Ultimately, of course, we would need an account of why we're blind to the relevant facts about knowledge. Just asserting that we're blind to something in the paradoxes is not fully satisfactory. A satisfactory answer to that, I think, will amount to a satisfactory theory of knowledge. An unerroneous temptation to which we're susceptible could then be explained in terms of implicit and partial commitment to an earlier unsatisfactory account. As with causation, for example, and many other concepts, with knowledge, I hypothesize, in part because of the undermining effect mentioned earlier of considering the possibility of the known propositions being false, I hypothesize that our confusion has to do with our inadequate understanding of subjunctive conditionals and our inadequate understanding of which such conditionals should figure in an analysis of knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you.